right. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 to 8 says this. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run into the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness, and a man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. And now Ecclesiastes 2, 22 to 26. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. This is God's word.
Thanks be God.
Well, before we dive in, I want to ask you a question. What would you say, again, this is like the elevator pitch, what would you say the book of Ecclesiastes is all about, if you've read it before? Brian? The meaninglessness of life without God. Good. Anybody else? It's an eye-opener. Yeah. It kind of like shocks you awake into the reality around you. Anybody else? All right. Well, the book of Ecclesiastes gives us one of the most intense, searing gazes into the frustrations of life. It is about the frustrations of life. And you know, as a book of wisdom, while the Proverbs give us wisdom for dominion, like we talked about last week, and living in the world faithfully with wisdom in various circumstances, Ecclesiastes honestly assesses the life that we live under the sun. That's a phrase that you see throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, and reveals that no matter how much you apply yourself, things just often don't make sense. Things just come apart. And it shows that true joy comes from the fear of God, regardless of the circumstances and frustrations of life. And so I've called our study through the book of Ecclesiastes, Wisdom for Joy. You'll hear as you read the book of Ecclesiastes, in the midst of all these frustrations, you have this constant call to joy in the middle of it. What's that about? Vanity of vanity. Everything is vanity, Ecclesiastes says. We'll be exploring this more later, but it's important to note here that the word for vanity is the Hebrew word hebel. And it's actually the same word we get the name Abel from in Genesis. But it literally means vapor or mist. So the frustrations that Ecclesiastes is gazing into has to do with the transitory, fading, and ungraspability of life. No matter how much you try, striving for control is like striving after the wind, striving after vapor. The vapor, it wisps out of your grasp, and it can be incredibly frustrating and wearisome if you are striving after that wind. And so we might ask, why? Why is life under the sun like this? Why is it this way? I think we get the answer actually from Romans 8. Romans 8 says this, 8:20 to 21. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. This helps us understand that phrase, by the way, under the sun, which is a term used throughout the book. life under the sun is life under this current age, lived between the creation being subjected to futility and creation being freed from the bondage to corruption. So there's a little bit of an already not yet kind of thing going on here. You have a life lived under the sun that is futile and vaporous because it's been subjected to futility. But we are also looking forward to the day when it is not so. And we're living in this tension in the meantime. Now, because of this claim that everything is vanity that Ecclesiastes makes, many conclude that it's ultimately a pessimistic book, or it's cynical. Some claim it gives us a kind of apologetics lesson to show us that unbelief leads to absurdity of believing that everything is vain. And so it's kind of like showing you that unbelief heads toward this. It heads towards absurdity. Others claim that it's a pessimistic and cynical book entirely because, according to this view, it's the product of Solomon when he had rebelled against God in his later years. In this view, it's primarily a negative example, a kind of warning of what folly will do to you if you turn your back on God. Now, as we look at the entirety of the book, I think we will see that both of these options are not really tenable. They're not really tenable options. This book is an honest book, but it is a book that is not pessimistic. It actually encourages joy in the midst of frustrations, in the midst of the vapor. And this is important because there are frustrations in this world that has been subjected to futility, and Christians, we're not called to pessimism or cynicism. We have an astounding hope that transforms the way we relate to everything, and it's not a pessimism that we are transformed into. And so as we look at the book of Ecclesiastes tonight, in our first night of covering this book, we're going to consider those frustrations and how Ecclesiastes calls us to joy in the midst of it. But before we go there, it's important to just consider and cover the author and some Old Testament background that I believe really helps us understand this book, okay? So first, the author. The book of Ecclesiastes opens with this verse. It says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." The words of the preacher. That's who wrote the book. Now, the word translated as preacher here is actually a Hebrew word, and it's the Hebrew word koholeth. And it doesn't exactly mean preacher. It is related to preaching, but it doesn't mean preacher. The word actually means gatherer or assembler. To kohel means to assemble a gathering, okay? So when you send out invitations to a birthday party, what are you? You are koholeth. You are assembling people to a gathering. Koholeth is a gatherer of the people. And this is actually why the book is called Ecclesiastes, okay? Ecclesia is the Greek word that is often translated in the New Testament as church. What does that word mean? It means gathering, okay? So ecclesia means gathering. Guess what Ecclesiastes means? It means the one who calls the gathering. It's koholeth. It's a Greek translation of koholeth. Okay? So who is this koholeth? Well, he also identifies himself as the son of David, and throughout the book, he identifies himself as a king, a man of wisdom, a man who built many things, many buildings, many projects, planted many gardens and orchards, a man who amassed a lot of wealth. So who fits all these things? Solomon. Solomon fits all these things. And so the church throughout centuries has believed that Solomon is koholeth. And many scholars today, of course, because they're just fond of denying stuff, they deny this, right? That's what scholars do. They like to obscure simple things. So, and if you're looking at commentaries, and they'll always try to say, it doesn't really appear to be this person. They have really ridiculous reasons for why. So I think the best answer for who wrote this, it's Solomon, okay? And I'm going to help you. I think I'll give you some more reasons for why that is. So here's a question, though. Did Solomon ever call an assembly? Did he ever do any kohola thing? Yes, he did. As king, he was the one who called the people to special feasts in Jerusalem. Notice, if you know your Bible, you know there's 3 different feasts that regularly required the people to come to Jerusalem. They were Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths. And in 1 Kings chapter 8, we read about a time when Solomon called an assembly to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Booths and the dedication of the temple that he had just finally finished, along with many of his palaces. We read in 1 Kings 8:2, and all the men of Israel assembled to King Solomon at feast in the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. And if you knew your Bible, you know that the feast that people go to Jerusalem to in the 7th month, it's the Feast of Booths. It's the Feast of Booths. Every 7th month on the Hebrew calendar, Solomon, the king, during his reign, would have assembled the people to celebrate the Feast of Booths, where they brought their harvest in, and they commemorated and celebrated their time of living in booths in the wilderness after the Exodus. It was basically an 8-day party of rejoicing to the Lord. And they celebrated it by living in these temporary structures made of palm branches and willow branches and leafy tree branches. And the reason I bring that up is because I actually believe the Feast of Booths, which is the one time we have an instance of Solomon actually calling a gathering in the Bible, I believe the Feast of Booths is actually a really good analogy for a lot of what we learn in the book of Ecclesiastes. And maybe even it's very plausible that this book, Ecclesiastes, was at one time read during one of these feasts, okay? Let me give you my reason for why, okay? Imagine for a moment the experience of participating in the Feast of Booths, right? Everybody's living outside in these temporary and transitory tents made of palm leaves and tree branches. By the end of day 8, when it was coming to an end, what do you think your little temporary booth looked like, right? Probably looked a little run down, leaves were turning brown, crispy, and things just would have been looking pretty rough, pretty shoddy. And throughout this time that you were, living in these temporary booths, and you were also celebrating how your people wandered through the wilderness, a place unmanageable and unsupportive of life, and yet where they received sustenance directly from the hand of God through manna, through quail, and through the water from the rock. And not only that, but this is interesting. The word for booths is sucketh in the Bible, which is kind of a funny word. And it is often a word used poetically to describe clouds, vaporous clouds. Okay? These booths that they were living in temporarily were misty. They were temporary, like vapor. They fade away in time. But here's the thing. At the same time, the Feast of Booths was a great time of what? Rejoicing. Right? People bringing in their tithes from far and wide. And those tithes weren't just given to the temple. They were tithes that they ate, that they enjoyed, that they rejoiced in. And they were rejoicing in the midst of all this transitoriness. The people would travel to Jerusalem, and they'd bring their stuff. We actually see instruction in Deuteronomy 14 of what they were supposed to do. Okay, listen to this. And if the way to Jerusalem is too long for you, so that you're not able to carry the tithe, when the Lord your God blesses you, because the place is too far from you, which the Lord your God chooses to set his name there, which is Jerusalem, then you shall turn it into money. Turn your tithe, which would have been, oxen and would have been grain, turn it into money in your hand, and then go to the place the Lord your God chooses and spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves, and you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. Okay? In that passage in Deuteronomy, which is instruction for when you go to one of these feasts, we see the 3 things that Ecclesiastes mentions with frequency every time it calls the people of God to joy. At these feasts, they were called to eat, right? Which is why you brought the oxen or the sheep with you. That's translation steak and lamb chops, okay? And they were called to drink, bring wine or strong drink, which would have been wine or basically beer. And they were called to rejoice before the Lord their God, which would have undoubtedly included singing songs of praise to him. In other words, God's people at this feast, in the midst of their transitory booths, were called to eat, drink, and be merry before the Lord in a transitory and frustrating world. This, in a nutshell, is one of the major themes of Ecclesiastes. And so now with the Feast of Booths in our mind, we're going to consider the way Ecclesiastes talks about how God has provided a table of joy and rejoicing in the midst of the vapor. Okay? Vapor, everything is vapor, Koheleth says. What does he mean by this? Well, if you read what he says, he observes the world around him, and he sees things. He sees things under the sun that are repetitive and don't come to a conclusion, right? All the streams run into the sea. The water's evaporated up into the sky. Then the rain comes down back into the streams, and they do it all over again and over again. And yet the sea is never filled. We see this kind of thing in our lives too. A child, he talks about generations coming and generations going. A child is born. He grows up, he goes to school, he graduates, he goes to college, he gets a degree, he gets a job, he gets married, he has a family, he amasses wealth, he grows old, and then, like all of us, like the way of all earth, he dies. And then his kids go on and do the same thing. And it happens over and over again. Similarly, you go to work and you do the same thing over and over. And you cut the grass, and it grows back. You remodel the house, and then in a couple of years, you need to remodel it again. You spend your efforts. If you're like a software developer, you develop software, and then in 2 years, it's completely obsolete. You start over again. Then you might be tempted to wonder, what am I doing? Or does any of this matter? Things are weary. Toil under the sun is vexing. Days are full of sorrow. You try to control things, but they slip through your fingers. When you think you have things under control, it blows up in your face, and you have to pick up all the pieces. And in this world, the pleasures of this world come and go, but the eye is not satisfied with seeing, and the ear is not satisfied with hearing. Like the Rolling Stones song, Solomon could have said, I can't get no satisfaction. Right? That's what's being said here. Everything under the sun is transitory. It's ungraspable. It's vapor and wind. You can't grasp or control wind or vapor, and things fall apart. Okay? Striving after the wind is another term that is used throughout Ecclesiastes, and it conveys the same idea. And by the way, more literally, it's actually shepherding the wind. Okay? In the text, it's actually shepherding the wind. This is what you're doing when you try to look for satisfaction in your own ability to control your life or the world around you. And you all know what this is like. So much of our life is like trying to herd cats. It's trying to shepherd wind. And especially the person who doesn't know God, they're just constantly trying to it's like whack-a-mole. You're trying to figure out what's going to satisfy you. You move from one thing to another, and this thing falls apart, and you try to go and fix it by doing something else. Things don't stay put. People surprise you in devastating ways. People on your team that you relied upon move, and you have to rebuild your team from scratch. And parenting is a lot like herding cats. And you're frustrated. You don't know, why is what I'm doing not working? And then sin comes into things and spoils good things. Things were super nice at Christmas the last 7 years, then something sinful happens, and all of a sudden that thing that used to be good has this taint of sin. Or you have an amazing investment strategy, and all of a sudden the stock market plunges, and you have to rethink everything. That's the vexation and weariness that Ecclesiastes is talking about. And no matter how wise you are, you're going to find that you can't actually get any leverage to actually control these things. It's all wind. So here's a question for you. What are some examples of shepherding wind or attempting to control your life through managing things? What are some examples of that in life that you guys could think of? Trying to control somebody else's actions? Planning a vacation based on the weather report. I almost use Washington weather as an example here. It's like they think they know what's going to come. They never do. That's like a good analogy for Ecclesiastes. Anything else? Trying to reason with the 4-year-old? Vexation. Throughout Ecclesiastes, Solomon uncovers many aspects of life that are attempts to shepherd the wind. In Ecclesiastes 1:12-18, he gives that description of all these things that just, repeat themselves. And he talks about the futility of chasing after novelty, because there's actually nothing new under the sun. In Ecclesiastes 2-17, Solomon talks about his achievements, his houses, his vineyards, his wealth, his pleasures, and how they yield no lasting gain. He says, all was vanity and striving after the wind. In Ecclesiastes 2:18-23, he talks about how toil is fleeting, as one's legacy may pass to a fool, offering no control over the future. You're going to live and you're going to build this thing, and you have no control over who's going to take it after you die. In Ecclesiastes 1:12-18, we see that pursuing knowledge to master the world brings sorrow, because wisdom has limits. You cannot save yourself from sorrow by becoming wise. You're always going to experience sorrow. And also, we read, in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Now, that doesn't mean that wisdom is bad, but it means you cannot look to wisdom as this means of controlling the world, of getting leverage. And then we see in Ecclesiastes 2:18-23, he goes on to say that just like the fool will die and will be forgotten, all of his projects are going to come to nothing, and when he dies, he's going to pass it down to somebody, and then he's just going to be completely forgotten. And this reminds me of that famous poem by Shelley called Ozymandias. Does anybody know that poem? Ozymandias? Okay, in this poem by Shelley, he imagines a traveler visiting the ruins of a statue of a long-forgotten king. And all that's left standing of this statue are these two trunkless legs of stone, and in the sand near them is this head of the statue. That's been shattered, and it has a frown and a wrinkled lip, and it has Shelley says, the sneer of a cold command. And then he turns to the pedestal that is covered in sand, and he reads it. And on the pedestal, he reads this: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And then it says, "Nothing besides remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." No one knows who Ozymandias is. That's the point. It's just a made-up name. His memory's forgotten, and his pride, captured on this pedestal, has been humbled by the elements over the centuries under the sun. That's how life is under the sun. It humbles all who think they can control their destiny through their works and their efforts. And if we're honest with ourselves, we so often are tempted to proudly control our destiny by shepherding wind. But here's the deal. What is in your bank account? Wind. What is your college degree? Wind. What is your health? Wind. Your retirement fund? Wind. Political successes? Wind. You can labor towards these things, and often you will with frustration, but you cannot count on them to last. They will blow away. And now, that's just a slice of the searing gaze into the frustrations of life that Ecclesiastes gives us. But after Ecclesiastes gives us this first round of an honest assessment of the weariness that he sees under the sun, he gives us one of the most profound calls to joy. He says, "There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat and who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. This is the reality. This is actually a picture of true Christian joy. True Christian joy is not Pollyanna joy. It's not glib joy. It's not rose-colored glasses joy that just pretends things are okay when they're not okay. It doesn't put the blindfold on so we can pretend that frustrations don't exist. True Christian joy is actually a miracle because it is a gift that comes from God by faith. Even while by sight, we're confronted by the frustrations of the vapor. This gift of joy from God actually frees us to even enjoy the vapor. That's what we see in this passage and throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes moves like a spiral, wrestling with the frustrations of life and always returning back to this gift of God of joy in the vapor. I have in your handout that the book can be separated into 4 parts, and that each one of those parts ends with a similar call to joy in the midst of the vapor. And here's the thing. This is why shepherding the wind never amounts to anything. When you attempt to shepherd the wind, you're really attempting to be God. But joy does not come from trying to be God. It comes as a gift from the hand of God. And so when we stop trying to be God and instead look to Him as our satisfaction, He actually gives us enjoyment even in the vapor. This reminds me of something that C.S. Lewis said. He said, if you aim at heaven, okay, your life is aimed towards God. If you aim at heaven, you will get earth thrown in. But if you aim at earth, you'll get neither. That's a really good summary of what Ecclesiastes is saying. He says there's nothing better than when Ecclesiastes says there's nothing better for a person than to eat, drink, and find enjoyment, this is not some hedonistic or pagan way of viewing life. This is actually a Christian calling. Remember the lesson from the Feast of Booths. As they remember the wilderness in their transitory booths, God calls His people to rest in Him, enjoy a feast before Him of food and drink, and rejoice before Him. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute. Didn't Jesus tell us a parable that actually contradicts this entirely? Maybe some of you guys are remembering Luke 12. This is what Jesus says. The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So this is one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Is Jesus contradicting Ecclesiastes here? If you listen closely, you'll see he's not. He's actually saying the same thing, but from the other end. The man in the parable isn't rich in God. He's not resting in God. He's aiming at earth, and so he loses earth and heaven. He's resting in his ability, his works, and his riches. He's shepherding the wind. And his soul is in danger because he doesn't fear God. So question, how does Ecclesiastes' view of joy as a gift from God differ from worldly pursuits of happiness? Like Christians enjoy the same thing the world enjoys, but it's different. It's inherently different. How does this view of joy differ from the worldly pursuit of joy? Dawn.
I think in part because the world views it as something they've obtained on their own,
Mm-hmm.
whereas we realize, yes, it's through us, but it's from God that He's used us to give us these things, and so we
The world's view looks at the things that we do as ultimate, like we're ultimately resting in ourselves. But the Christian view is we see all the things as true gifts from God that are actually meant to be enjoyed, but as from his hand. Anybody else? Brian. Yes, everything else is subject to change. This is something that's going to come up later in Ecclesiastes, is the things just change. And so if you're standing on whatever that thing is, and that's where your joy ultimately is, you're just going to go up and down with whatever that thing is. But if you fear God and you're resting in God, as the things arise, you enjoy them, you give thanks for them, they go away, you're like, okay, that's what vapor does. God isn't vapor. He doesn't change. Anybody else? So the lesson here is these misty pleasures and activities make awful gods. But under God, they can be received as signs of his goodness, of his kindness, and his provision. God gives both the pleasures of life themselves, life itself, and the power to enjoy those things. Like both of those things. That's one of the things you see in this particular book. God not only gives the things, he's the one who gives the ability, the power to enjoy them. And only believers who trust God and fear God receive the joy, the gift of enjoying the vapor for what it is. As we read earlier, for to the one who pleases him, pleases God, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. And here's the key to this joy. Joy comes from trusting him. And while unbelievers are busy with toil, that part I read earlier says that all their efforts only end up being truly enjoyed by believers, by those who please God. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying that the pagan who is living for himself is producing things, and only the Christian can even truly enjoy them for what they are. Here's an example of this. Imagine the pagan chef who has toiled and perfected his craft. Why? To make a name for himself. Okay? This is why his efforts have driven him to be this amazing chef. For him, this toil is an attempt to shepherd the wind. But what happens when a Christian couple visits that chef's restaurant on an anniversary date with his wife after a difficult year of job changes and various frustrations and losses, and they eat and they drink and they praise God for these things that point to his goodness? The Christian has the gift of enjoying that glorious meal from the sovereign hand of God with true joy. The reason the frustrations and vapor don't bring us to despair is because while we cannot shepherd the wind, we believe and trust in a God who can and who does. He's the one who shepherds the wind. He's sovereign over all the vapor. And at the end of Ecclesiastes, God is called the one shepherd. That's why I think it's important to not translate it striving, but rather translate it shepherding, because you see this connection if you see this. In Psalm 18, we actually have a description of God coming down on Mount Sinai, and he's driving his chariot of wind and clouds. Listen to Psalm 18. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him. We can't control the vapor, but God can. In fact, he rides upon it. It's his chariot. He's sovereign over all matter. He's sovereign over our lives. He's sovereign over time. That's why in Ecclesiastes 3, we have that famous poem that, was turned into the song by the birds. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. Now skipping ahead a little bit, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And then it goes on. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. That's a list for how God shepherds the timing of things. All of these things in world history, the rise and fall of kings, the droughts, the famines, the times of plenty, they're all under his sovereign hand. He is completely in control of all these things. And in his wisdom, he shepherds them so that their timing is beautiful. And that word is actually beautiful or fitting. It's fitting or beautiful according to his timing. And it should actually, the things listed should actually cause us to be thankful for the transitory nature of these things in life. For instance, I was listening to a guy named James Jordan talk about this, and he said, you should be thankful that things are vapor and blow away. For instance, isn't it good that Hitler and the Third Reich was vapor and it blew away? Isn't it good that Stalin and the Soviet Union was vapor and it blew away? How many other vaporous things are we thankful to God that he blew away? That's like kind of a negative approach to go, I'm glad it's vapor, and I'm glad he's the one shepherding the wind. So here's a question for you. How does trusting God's sovereignty enable you to experience joy in the midst of the vapor?
I don't have to get stressed out about every minute detail and consequence. I can trust God that he has the consequence, that he's not drunk at the wheel.
Yes, you can trust that God is not drunk at the wheel, and you don't have to think about every possible detail in order to get all the things just right. You know, I was thinking about a lot of anxiety occurs because we are not content to not be God. Like we want this minute detail control over so much of our life, and what we really need to do is just have an open hand and say, God, you're in charge. Now, that doesn't mean we don't put effort into things. You're going to see later in the book of Ecclesiastes that there's a lot of practical encouragements to make effort, to work with all your might with your hand while you do live, and a lot of encouragements to do certain things and to seek wisdom, but not seeking it in such a way that you are God, that you're trying to make yourself God over the situation. Now think about it. It's good that man can't shepherd the wind. If man could shepherd the wind, that would actually be reason for concern and worry. But because God shepherds the wind, he establishes times and seasons so that they're fitting, and it is this sovereignty of God that is the reason we can find enjoyment even in the toil, because that means the enjoyment that comes is truly a gift from his hand. We're not striving for it, we're receiving it. It is the sovereignty of God that, and here's the thing, as we look to God and fear him, we learn to see the world through the eyes of faith in his sovereignty rather than according to our sight and observation of the vapor that we experience. This is why Ecclesiastes is really a book about faith. The world by sight looks this way, but what does God say? And you're believing it, and you're believing it in faith. So you tell yourself, rather than be like, everything is falling through my fingers, I can't enjoy anything, you tell yourself what is true. God has given me this gift. This is a sign of his goodness to me. This is a sign of his kindness. And I can actually enjoy this and give thanks to him and rest in him. There's a kind of relationship here to a normal week, right? Every seventh day, the people come to a holy convocation in the Old Testament, or the church gathering in the New Testament, and they come, and what do? They rest, they rejoice, and they feast. after a week of working with their hands and being frustrated that the bolt won't come off your truck. Like that's the rhythm. Work, toil, and you're given the gift of even enjoying that. And then you come, you take a break, you stop all that, you rejoice with the people of God, you feast at his table, a table in the midst, and you receive it all as a gift. That's what we're called to as Christians. And here's the thing, and we're going to talk more about this later, because this gets unpacked later in the book of Ecclesiastes. Because God is sovereign over all things, and he can shepherd the wind, even though by sight it looks like everything is, vanity and vaporous, in the Lord your labor is not in vain. He's actually shepherding history. He's shepherding timing. The fact that you're here is a part of his shepherding all this stuff. And yes, in the Lord, your labor is not in vain. And that might sound contradictory to what this is saying, but this is the difference between sight, under the sun, and then when you go into the sanctuary and you see what nature can't reveal to you, which is God is sovereign, God is a Savior, he has redeemed you, he is going to redeem all things in Christ. And so by faith, you receive from his hand all these things as gifts, and you also trust that when you labor, your labor is not in vain. Again, this is a book all about walking by faith instead of sight, and how you can have this true joy in the midst of the frustrations of life. When something falls apart, we remember that the timing comes from God. The same God that made every pleasure, and the same God is the same God who provided his Son to suffer in time for us, so we could know him and thus have reason for hope and reason for rejoicing in all things. So next week, when we come back to Ecclesiastes, we're going to look closer at the last two parts and we're going to also consider something that's interesting to think about. Who is the great Koholeth? Who's the great one who gathers the people? Who is the great one who gathers the people together and gives them wisdom for joy? It's a Sunday school answer. Jesus. Jesus is the one who calls us out of the darkness, calls us out of the vapor, calls us out of the mundane ways that we search for meaning, and he rescues us out of that, and he brings us into his joy, and he makes everything meaningful. This is not a book about meaninglessness. It's a book about how everything is futile and falls through your fingers. That's why you trust the God who is over it all. And in him, you're brought into the joy of even enjoying the things that are passing, but also the joy of knowing that there is nothing meaningless in him.